start. Thanks to Martine for the introduction and to Shane and Davide for the kind invitation, and to Davide especially also for some very useful bibliographical references. My paper is, I think, a bit of an outsider in this conference. The organizers had asked me to speak about the historiographical side of things, and much can be done, surely, about Athenian institutions in Hellenistic historiography, and there is some work already on democracy and on demagogues in Hellenistic historiography, etc. The topic I selected for my paper today deals with the question of Athens as a colony of Egypt, in the way it appears mostly in Diodorus, but as I will hopefully show especially in Hekataios of Abdera. So the structure of my paper today is first of all a very brief prelude on the prestige of Athens in Hellenistic historiography, to which my paper will hopefully make a small contribution. Then I will, unfortunately, and I know Quellenforschung is a dirty word and a dirty activity, but I will, in order to understand the text, have to go into the question of its origins. So I will also speak about Hekataios as a source of Diodorus Book 1, which is all the more necessary because there is some recent debate about this question. Then I will also briefly look into Diodorian and Hecatean elements in Diodorus 1:28 to 29, which is the first passage on your handout, the fairly long account on why the Egyptian priests claim that Athens was a colony of Egypt from Egyptian size. And then the third main point will be the main focus, namely the political significance of Hekataios' work and of this passage about the Athenian origins. So my prelude, because I have much to cover, I will be very brief about this. I mainly refer to some earlier scholarship. So of course, at the first point, I mustn't say early Hellenistic Athens, but just as a shorthand, I do it. The bibliographic references that are only giving author and year are to be found more fully in the abstract on the conference website. So there I give the full bibliography. So ethnography was read in the Hellenistic world, although most of the fragments of the actual fragments of the ethographers are only from Roman times. But that surely also has to do with the fact that most Hellenistic historiography is lost. Also, Athens in the late 4th and early 3rd century is a center of Hellenistic, of historiographic activity. Also, something Catherine Clark, for instance, has recently treated: the spread of the use of Athenian archons for dating purposes in texts that do not or not solely contain Athenian history. And in my context, of course, also very relevant to think of the admiration of the Athenian past in Diodorus, of which Schmitz has recently shown that many elements that are later found in the standard view of the Athenian past and Second Sophistic are already there, but it's not quite the same Athens as we find in the Second Sophistic. There are other voices as well, famously, of course, Polybius, which, of course, I think is also to do in part with Polybius' specifically Peloponnesian perspective, but that's something I can't go into right now. I had a few more interesting passages from Diodorus, which I will also, for reasons of time, not go into, but again, in the time of the successors here, Athenians and many other Greek cities, so the Athenians were still one of the leading polis in Greece, and it's not surprising considering their role, especially, of course, in the Lemnian War, but also in the Charmanidean War. So Athens clearly is and remains a prestigious city in post-classical times and in post-classical historiography. The passage I'll be looking at in book 1 of Diodorus, as I said, it is important to go into the question what its origins are. For a long time, it was widely accepted that Diodorus Book 1 is for the most part an adaptation of the Aegyptiaca of Hekataios of Abdera. So just some bibliographic references here, but there has also been criticism of this view recently, for instance, by Muntz and Caneva. The main counter-arguments are specifically Diodorus tended to use multiple sources. The evidence for Hekataios as the source of Diodorus is limited, and the ideas of the priest's power over the king does not suit the intentions of Ptolemy Soter, and therefore cannot be attributed to the work of Hekataios that was produced at the Ptolemaic court. The last one is one I'll come back to later, because that's specifically for Hekataios, and it will, of course, be a central question also in looking at the political intentions behind the story of Athens as an Egyptian colony. So for the claim that Diodorus used multiple sources, that's of course one that fits in the recent rehabilitation of Diodorus. I can't go into that right now. We can talk about it in the discussion if you like, but the traditional view persists just as well. Here, just some recent examples. This is one of the starting points for Muntz in his argument. So the belief that Diodorus would not have used multiple sources for the first book is impossible to prove satisfactorily without access to Diodorus sources for comparison. Instead, the argument is made by falling back on perceived characteristics of Diodorus himself. And I think Muntz is largely right to criticize these arguments about the stupidity and incompetence of Diodorus as evidence for his using a single source. But I don't necessarily think that that's all there is to be said. The Diodorian problem, I think, can be schematized as follows. It begins with the premise that good historians critically compare all the available sources, which obviously is true nowadays. For the traditional view on the Einquellentheorie, which of course, like any good theory, is not just made up, but has a strong evidential basis, since Diodorus usually only used a single source, he was a mindless compiler. In the rehabilitation of Diodorus, it has been shown, again rightly, that Diodorus was not as stupid as the traditional view assumes, and on this then is based the conclusion that Diodorus used all the available sources, or at least the most important ones. I think the problem is with the general premise, which does not hold for ancient authors writing about the remote past. So the method of Thucydides is very clearly limited for the most part to contemporary history, and then to certain authors who have a stronger antiquarian interest, but narrative accounts of the farther past usually tend to be based on a single source. That, of course, is a claim I cannot prove here. I would just point to the long list of writers once considered mindless compilers for the very same reason, namely that often when we can check, they use a single source for long stretches of their narrative. Indeed, this approach to Diodorus has recently also been criticized by Dublin, who, for the question of distinguishing between Diodorus' direct use of the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia or using it via Ephorus, says, I do not think it is good enough just to say that modern scholarship is more open to the idea that Diodorus read and combined a variety of sources rather than simply epitomizing a single source. And so if one wants to make that claim, it needs to be proven. That's fair enough. But I think it's hard to prove that, for which reason a new sort of compromise view on Diodorus is now also originating, which claims that his originality lies in other areas, not in his use of sources, but in what he does when he constructs his own complete work with that. So for the use of a single source, I would refer to an article of mine where I treat this question in more detail. But even if you would not agree with that, one could still say, as Pitcher does, for instance, who does argue that most authors will have combined various sources, that Diodorus still seems to be an exception, for good reasons. So I think just as a premise, that Diodorus would have combined multiple sources, I think this can be fairly easily disproven, and but unfortunately I cannot go into that here, but the authors who claim that as an argument against Hekataios usually do not really go into the question either. The positive case for Hekataios, I think, is still fairly strong, although there is only one direct quotation, but one, as Oswin Murray and others have shown, that although it does not seem to be like that, actually in context reveals that Hekataios has been used for much more than just this one passage. Also, several fragments of Hekataios can be fitted into Diodorus' account. Muntz is surely right that not all of these fragments fit in as clearly or converge as clearly with Diodorus as previous scholarship might have held, but even so, I think this evidence is not to be neglected. Then it is also clear that the chronology of the account, or basically the setting, the chronological setting of the account, is mostly the time of Ptolemy Soter. So there are several passages where Diodorus says in the time of Ptolemy Soter, and then says, well, continuing down to our own time, just as a sort of brief addition. Again, this has been discussed in more detail by Murray and others. Also, there is the same structure and tendency as in Hekataios' other ethnographic works, and the unity and internal consistency of most of Book 1 in terms of interest, tone, details, and chronology. This latter argument, of course, also depends on the extent to which these are specifically Diodorian, but not all of these elements are Diodorian. And just briefly for comparison, the evidence for Diodorus' history of the Diadochoi, where it is almost universally agreed that Hieronymus is the main source. So sources cited in the narrative of the successors are only Pythagoras and Homer. Fragments, there are two fairly close and somewhat elaborate parallels between the fragments of Hieronymus and Diodorus' text, but only fragment 5, because of clear verbal echoes, is the only one about which consensus exists. I think there's good reasons to accept this one as well. The other ones are merely convergence of facts, basically, which do not necessarily prove any source relationship. The same is true for the fragments of Duras and Daeilus. There is also a good case for a fragment of Hekataios, to which I'll come back later as well. But in any case, then evidence for Diodorus sources is rarely very extensive, because we rarely have reliable and long fragments of his sources. And when we do have those, it is indeed clear that he used one source at a time, and which one. Also because he rarely cites his sources. So, I mean, if the argument is to be that he cites Hekataios only once, well, he cites none of the authors for Hellenistic history at all in his account of the Diadochoi. He also does not cite any of the Alexander historians in book 17. On balance, I think the evidence for Hekataios as the source of most of Diodorus' book 1 is still strong, and I might be able to add a few arguments to that later when we go into more detail into the passages that are of specific interest to us today. So this much for my first part. There are admittedly a lot of Diodorian elements in the account of Athens as a colony of Egypt. I've not specified references here because that would be too much, but these are all topics in which Diodorus is strongly interested, but at the same time, they're all also topics in which such an interest is rarely very specifically Diodorian. The case of the Eleusinian mysteries might be a bit of an exception here, but then again, what we would expect of Diodorus in this respect is not found in our passage. And also, if we look at his interest in polyanthropia, it is noticeable that the word polyanthropia occurs predominantly in book 1. So book 1 is the only Diodorian book in which the word occurs more than once. It does not occur in all books, but there are some other books in which it does occur once. However, this interest in polyanthropia is also seen in other fragments of Hekataios. And just to be clear, for those who know the question, I'm not including the long Hecatean fragment that is Diodorus book 1. So obviously that would be a circular argument. So I'm excluding Diodorus book 1. Only the Hecatean fragments that do not come from Diodorus book 1 have been included here. And we can see that these fragments all show these same features, with the exception perhaps of the euhemeristic theology. But again, Oswin Murray has convincingly shown that this was already present in Hekataios. So the Eleusinian mysteries are not so present otherwise in Hekataios, but of course we have few fragments in which they would have been relevant at all anyway. There is more to be said maybe here about the criticism of the priestly claim about Athenian origins at the very end of our passage. So that's the bottom of page 2 and the beginning of page 3 of the handout, where Diodorus says, by many other statements like these, spoken more out of a love for glory than with regard for the truth, as I see the matter, they claim Athens as a colony of theirs because of the fame of that city. In general, the Egyptians say that their ancestors sent forth numerous colonies to many parts of the inhabited world, the preeminence of their former kings and their excessive population. But since they offer no precise proof whatsoever for these statements, and since no historian worthy of credence testifies in their support, we have not thought that their accounts merited recording. This passage is usually taken as a specific Diodorian edition. Murray, for instance, comments that even Diodorus, usually so credulous here, actually professes his disbelief. I think, however, that there are some reasons for assuming that the criticism might, at least in part, already have been present in Hekataios. It would not be beyond Diodorus to adopt methodological and source critical statements from his sources. Many such cases have been proven, also relating to Egypt by Peremans and Desange, for instance, or by Walbank in Diodorus' use of Polybian polemics. And in some passages where Diodorus relies directly on Polybius, we can see the same thing, that he's not at all worried about presenting Polybius' opinion as his own. The only Diodorian instance of Alethinos combined with Legain is this specific one, and of the 15 instances of Alethinos in the Bibliothek, there are only 5 that are used in the sense of truthful, and in one other instance of Alethinos, in any case, it can be shown that Diodorus borrows the phrasing of his source. The comparative of Alethinos is mostly found in philosophical and grammatical texts, with the exception of Polybius, but it is not otherwise attested in Diodorus. The combination of akribes and apodexis, again, is mostly philosophical and not otherwise attested in Diodorus. And of the 11 instances of apodexin or apodexis pherein, again, a philosophical phrase. In Diodorus, 5 occur in book 1, the only book with more than one instance. And likewise, Axiopistos only twice in Diodorus. It's again not uncommon in philosophical works. It's also the only instance of graphes axios in Diodorus. And then there is the missed opportunity to mention that Demeter first gave grain to the Sicilians. So Diodorus does not deny that the Athenians were early on. They came second after the Sicilians in terms of the gift of grain, and on that basis founded the Eleusinian mysteries. But usually, as you can see, for instance, in handout 13, Diodorus will, even when he talks about other peoples making such claims, be sure to include the Sicilians there. Of course, this is not conclusive evidence, but I do think it shows to some extent that Diodorus, who is usually, especially in this kind of passage, quite repetitive, quite formulaic, and then also the philosophical nature of so much of this vocabulary is perhaps an indication that Hekataios would already have criticized these claims by the Egyptians. I think he would also have had good reasons for this. Hekataios, we know of his philosophical affiliations, and also specifically in the case of the Aegyptiaca, the strong philosophical and Platonic influence has been shown by Murray and Nesselrad, amongst others. So there are, I think, good reasons for believing that Hekataios already criticized the claims of the Egyptian priests. And this brings us to the political significance of Hekataios' work, and specifically also of this passage. Many scholars nowadays hold that there are merely ethnographic and philosophic intentions behind Hekataios' work. I mean, the political philosophy, as I've just mentioned, is clear. Refer, for instance, to Murray Nesselrad. But the ethnographic dimension has recently been treated by Grün, who is one of those scholars who denies the political dimension. So in Grün's view, Hekataios would hardly build such a portrait of pharaonic governance on the prodding of the Ptolemaic king. Hekataios went his own way, postulating a political agenda is unnecessary and unwarranted. So this is already the argument I mentioned in the beginning, that because so much stress is placed on the importance and power of the Egyptian priest, including their power over the king in traditional pharaonic monarchy, this could not have pleased Ptolemy I, and therefore Hekataios, who is clearly connected to the Ptolemaic court and seems to have acted as a diplomat, for instance, and will have surely also written this work under Ptolemaic patronage, cannot have served a political goal in this sense. So for Grün, the only interest of the Ptolemaic court here that was served by Hekataios is to bring invaluable information to the Ptolemaic court about their subjects. I think the political dimension of Hekataios' work can be proven in many ways. First of all, I think there's a very interesting fragment here from Diodorus, or echoing Diodorus 19, in which Ptolemy Soter is praised for his kingly qualities, and it is stated that for this reason many wanted to share his friendship and join his enterprise. So verbal echoes admittedly are limited and not very telling, but the overall tone of the passage is very similar, and its relationship has also recently been discussed by Robin Lane Fox and Livia Caponi. There is a bit of a problem in that this might be from a potentially spurious work of Hekataios, but even if that would be the case, this is likely to be one of the elements that pseudo-Hekataios would have taken from genuine Hekataios for the purpose of making his forgery seem all the more believable. There are important connections here to the same tendency on Ptolemy generally in Diodorus and other sources on the successors. Here, I think it is quite clear that Diodorus and Justin rely on the same source, making the exact same claim in the exact same context. And it's also interesting here that this philanthropos prosperestai is a typical Diodorian phrase, one that would lead Sachs and Soleimani, for instance, to say, well, this is clearly a Diodorian insertion. The idea is indeed found throughout the Bibliotheca. The language is also very typical of Diodorus. So the phrase philanthropos prosperestai occurs 30 times in antiquity, according to the TLG, and 20 times are in Diodorus. But Justin shows that the idea was already present in Diodorus' source, because Justin cannot, or Trogus in this case, and cannot have used Diodorus as a source. And again and again, we find in Diodorus this same praise of Ptolemy, which Lane Fox argues on the basis of these passages is thus not only found in Hekataios, but also in Cleitarchus and Hieronymus. Cleitarchus is possible, Hieronymus I deem extremely unlikely. I'll argue against that elsewhere, but in any case, Cleitarchus would not explain the origins in Diodorus' account on the successors. There might be more Hekataios here than we think. Now, other political aspects of Diodorus Book 1, and therefore I would say of Hekataios, apart from praise for Ptolemy, is to be found in such passages that have, as far as I've seen, but maybe I've missed something, so I'd be very grateful if someone can give me further suggestions there. But in as far as I've seen, rarely been discussed, that the campaign of Osiris, in which he conquers the whole known world. So he starts by leaving Heracles as general of the land, and then starts to conquer the world. And he was accompanied by his two sons, Anubis and Macedon, who were distinguished for their valor. This is more detail with the Greek text on handout 9 and also handout 10. Macedon, Osiris' son, moreover, he left as king of Macedonia, which was named after him, while Triptolemus, he assigned the care of agriculture in Attica. And then, of course, there is also our passage about Athens as an Egyptian colony. I have some passages from Herodotus, Plato, and Isocrates on the handout, numbers 15 to 17, which show that this is not at all a statement without political relevance. So claims for Athenian hegemony are based on their autochthony, are based on the fact that they are the ones who received the grain from Demeter and instituted the Eleusinian mysteries and spread this benefaction over the rest of the world. These are all, I would say, statements that could not have been made in an early Hellenistic political context without a strong political relevance. I think it is fairly likely that Hekataios would also have denied that the Macedonians also came from Egypt. I have no very good explanation yet for this discourse, but basically, if you take it all together, all of these passages and then 28 to 29, almost all of Greece and Macedon is basically originated from Egypt. And I do not think that this would have been a way to gain sympathy in Macedon amongst Macedonian elites, Macedonian kings, or those aspiring to be that, like Ptolemy, and also not amongst the Athenians. I think one clue is to be found in the reasons why Hekataios pays so much attention to the importance of the Egyptian priests. This can also be seen, I think, in Diodorus 194-95, which is number 3 on the handout, page 4, which usually is considered an insertion by Diodorus himself for arguments stated here. It contradicts part of the rest of book 1, but well, contradictions might have occurred in Hekataios just as well as in Diodorus. They might also have been less contradictory in the full Hecatean version. There is a very positive assessment of Darius as lawgiver in Egypt. There is, I think, no problem with this positive assessment, which strongly echoes Plato's laws. That's the 4th passage on the handout, and Plato's laws. Again, here I refer to Nesselrad for the strong influence of Plato's Republic and laws on Hekataios Aegyptiaca. The criticism of Macedonian rule at 95-6 might have been rephrased by Diodorus to sound a little bit harsher than it was in its original context, and it might not be incompatible with certain aspects of the discourse at Ptolemy's court in the early years. And again, here, Hekataios need not have agreed in every respect with all the priestly claims he reported. So I cannot discuss the passage in great detail, but so there's an entire overview of Egyptian lawgivers. The last one is Darius, who is treated positively. And then at the end, Diodorus says, the system of law throughout the land was the work of the men just named and gained renown that spread amongst other peoples everywhere. But in later times, they say many institutions which were regarded as good were changed after the Macedonians had conquered and destroyed once and for all the kingship of the native line. So, of course, this does indeed sound like a bit of an anti-Ptolemaic statement, but we have to remember it's very early in Ptolemy's reign, and much more might have been going on here. If we look at the Greek text of this negative judgment, it is perhaps rephrased by Diodorus. The phrase kataluen as telos before the 4th century CE is attested only 3 times and a half, maybe, if you will, twice in Diodorus and once in Plutarch. So this might be a somewhat more typically Diodorian phrase, might not come from Hekataios directly. Furthermore, for another part of the phrase, and again, you have the Greek on your handout on page 4, the closest parallel is in a passage in Diodorus specifically attributed to Hekataios, where likewise, in the context of Moses' excellent laws in Judea, it is said, but under the empires which rose up in later ages, especially during the rule of the Persians and in the time of the Macedonians, who overthrew the Persians, though intermingling with foreign nations, many of the traditional customs amongst the Jews were altered. This is the closest echo in terms of both language and idea in the entire Bibliothek, and so there's, I think, a good case there for both passages going back on to Hekataios. And here also we see it's not just the Macedonians, but the Persians as well, which might well have been the case in the other passage, later Persians after Darius, which is, again, what we find in the Plato passage as well. Cyrus and Darius were good. Darius was a good lawgiver. Plato also claims had success with his rule for that. Then things went downhill again. And so this phrase, which is not uncommon at all, so I've just listed some parallels for the language and the idea in Herodotus, there are many more, is overall fairly rare in Diodorus. And again, as I said, the closest echo is with another Hekataios passage. So I would say good reasons to believe that Hekataios was the source there, that the criticism of Macedonian rulers should be nuanced, and then, well, that a similar view would not at all be problematic in a work inspired by Plato's laws. The enemy of Egypt and of Ptolemy thereby in the satrap stele is also Xerxes, not Darius, and even if, as some claim, this would be Artaxerxes III, it's still not necessarily a problem for any claims made about Darius. Furthermore, and I'll have to be very brief about this, these passages are on your handout. There is in pseudo-Aristotle's Oikonomika much evidence that Ptolemy's predecessor in Egypt, Cleomenes of Naucratis, had a very antagonistic relationship with the priests and basically tried to extort money from them whenever he could. So Ptolemy had Cleomenes executed fairly soon after his arrival in Egypt, might also, as we know from Arrian, have judged negatively on Cleomenes. And I think this could be related to debates that we know from Alexander's court about the question whether or not native traditions were to be respected and maybe to some way, in some extent, even adopted by Macedonian rulers. We know no such debates from the age of the successors, but we have 7 times more. This, of course, is a very rough indication, but just counting the number of pages we have per year of Alexander history and per year of successor history leads us to an average of 7 times more for Alexander than for the successors. That's, of course, very rough, but in any case, I mean, it's clear that we know way more about Alexander than about the successors. We know of the importance of the native elites amongst the successors, with potential priestly involvement, for instance, in this instance of Seleucus in Babylon, where it is also said that the Babylonians favor Seleucus over Antigonus for reasons of the way he treated them and respected them. There is also, I think, an element of an Egyptian discourse about Ptolemy here, and then I will rush to my conclusion. But I think it seems that Hekataios also wanted to please the Athenians, an interest Ptolemy Soter also had. He tried to entertain good relations. The Athena on his coins has been explained in this context, and I find it more plausible than Lorber's attempt to connect this to Athena net of size, but again, I can't go into that. What is clear is that there was a lot of debate about the Athenian origins in Egypt. Callisthenes and Phanodemos, the editographer, obviously claim that the Athenians were the ancestors of the Saites. Theopompus said the was of the contrary opinion. Perhaps in a work written by Anaximenes, so in the Trikaranos, written perhaps by Anaximenes to damage Theopompus. But again, we see in late 4th century Greece, this debate is really relevant and causes anger in Athens, or is one of the elements with which Theopompus might have caused anger in Athens. And so Diodorus, or Hekataios rather, will have intervened here too, will have denied the Egyptian claims, which mostly relate, of course, because they're related to the farthest antiquity, to fairly archaic institutions. So I could say more about that. Unfortunately, there's no more time. In any case, I think Diodorus' adaptation of Hekataios still reveals much of its original interests. While much of what I said has been somewhat speculative, and some of it even more speculative, I do think it is clear that Hekataios supported Ptolemy's aims in terms of relations with the Egyptian priests and Greek polis. So as opposed to Cleomenes, we need good relationships with the Egyptian priests. Obviously, we also need good relationships with Greek polis, including Athens. This debate, as I said, seems to have been lively, but mostly related to not the institutions of the contemporary democratic polis, nonetheless a sign of the prestige of Athens and of the relevance of the discourse of the Greek polis world to Hellenistic court historiography in this text that will not have been unknown. Thanks for your attention, and sorry for the duration.